Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In these short videos, we're going to address the topics of corporate strategy. Corporate strategy is, quite simply, how you achieve long-term advantage, profitability, against competitors. Ultimately, whether you succeed or not depends on how you're positioned against your competitors and whether you can compete effectively against them to generate profits. As we think about business strategy, we're going to think about it from three perspectives, all of which determine whether or not we're able to generate long-term profits. The first element, you might be surprised, is not about the business itself, but about the industry that we're competing in. Different industries have different profitability levels, and so how we're able to perform in the long term is going to depend in part on which industry we're in. Second, how are we positioned against competitors? There's only so many viable strategies that we can use. We want to understand which strategy we're using compared to the other companies in the industry. And then finally, how do we outperform competitors? Performance is driven by capabilities, and there's a simple tool that we can use to begin thinking about whether or not we have the capabilities and resources available to enable us to achieve significant profitability over time. So to begin with, we're going to talk about industry attractiveness, and in the second video, we'll talk about the other two elements. The reality is that not all industries are created equal. It's easier to be profitable in an industry that consistently has high profits as compared to being in an industry that consistently has low profits. This should be pretty obvious. And sometimes you can choose which industry you compete in. So for example, if you had a novel electric motor technology, there's all sorts of different industries that you could compete in. You could build cars, or maybe you're just going to produce the motor itself and sell those to car companies. Maybe you're going to produce wind turbines or sell these motors to wind turbine companies. You could be involved in drones or remote control toys and so on. Sometimes you can't choose. So for example, if you have a small molecule therapeutic that's going to be used to treat cancer, you're pretty much in the therapeutics industry. There's not a lot of room for you to maneuver in that kind of situation. So we want to use this to understand the implication for how attractive the opportunity is. The surprising thing to many people on first seeing this is that we can have a pretty good sense of how attractive an industry is overall, and we use Porter's 5 forces model to assess this. The 5 forces in the model are threat of entry, threat of substitutes, rivalry, and the bargaining power of suppliers and buyers. Each force presses on the industry. So when we do this analysis, we're not doing it from the perspective of a startup company trying to get into the industry. We're doing it from the perspective of being in the industry already and recognizing how attractive and profitable this industry really is. The stronger the forces, the less attractive and less profitable the industry is likely to be. So let's walk through the different forces, and then we'll talk about a few examples. Rivalry is pretty straightforward. How competitive is the industry already? If there are lots of aggressive product launches, there's not a lot of growth, there's a reasonably large number of relatively equal competitors, all fighting for the same customers. Competition tends to be heavily cost-based, and competitors have a lot at stake, like this is their only market, their only industry that they compete in. Then rivalry is likely to be very high, which means that there's a lot of force pressing on the industry, and profits are likely to be low. On the other hand, if there are few battles or they're very slow, the market's growing incredibly fast, that means that there's lots of new customers available, or there are relatively few competitors, or so many competitors that no one has a significant market share. In either case, there tends to be actually less competition, less rivalry. And if competition is differentiated, that is, different companies are competing on different factors and features rather than all simply competing on cost. The threat of entry is the toughest one to understand. This is the one that usually confuses first-time entrepreneurs when they see it. And the reason is because they think, oh, an industry is attractive because we can get into it easily. And that, unfortunately, is exactly the wrong intuition. If you can get into the industry easily, then anyone can get into the industry easily. And when there's always new companies entering an industry, that tends to drive down prices and profits. In other words, for an industry to be attractive, we want the threat of entry to be low because it's hard to get into. Remember, we're assessing this from inside the industry, not as an entrepreneur trying to break into it. So threat of entry is high when there's lots of companies trying to get into it. When barriers are low, that is, for example, it doesn't cost very much to enter the industry. If the industry is growing and profitable, that tends to cause more companies to enter. If there are current competitors that are seeking new products or markets, or it's very easy for new entrants to make a profit, all of these actually increase the threat of entry, which will drive profits down eventually. When the threat of entry is low, that's beneficial to the industry and keeps profits high. So entry barriers, in particular, a high cost of entry. So think of it this way. The pharmaceutical industry is very difficult to get into because the cost of developing new drugs and getting those drugs approved for clinical use is extremely high, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. That makes it very hard for new companies to enter, and that means that the companies that are already there tend to be very profitable. If the industry the outlook is risky or the growth is slow or stagnant, there tend to be less companies trying to get in. Remember, we're assessing this from based on how profitable it is to be in the industry already, not how easy it will be to enter the industry. So an industry is attractive and profitable when it's hard to enter. Try to keep that in mind. This is the tough one. Substitution is not the same as competition or rivalry. Substitution is, are there other products and services out there that customers can access? We might think of this in the perspective of breakfast, right? So breakfast cereal is one product, and there are many competitors. There's a few competitors actually: Kellogg, Post, General Mills. And they produce lots of different kinds of cereals that compete with each other. But a substitute for breakfast cereal could be going out to a restaurant, or making eggs, or even just going without. Keep in mind that going without is almost always an available substitute, and in many cases it's the most important substitute. Supplier power simply addresses whether or not the organizations that supply you with what you need to produce your products or services have power over you. So, for example, if you need to buy widgets to make gadgets and there's only one company that makes those widgets, then that supplier has a lot of power over you. When inputs are in short supply, if that supplier is differentiated, or at any time if they could forward integrate to begin doing what you're doing, then they probably have a lot of power. If what you need is a commodity like sugar or corn, where there's lots and lots of providers, or if it's easy for you to switch from one supplier to another, or there are other substitutes you can use, then these are all indicators that the supplier power is relatively low, which means that the industry should be more attractive. Similarly with buyer power, if switching costs are low, that is, your customers can choose a different company to buy from, or if those customers are buying in large quantities, then they probably have a lot of power over you because they can change. If they change to another company, you would lose a significant amount of business. They may be able to negotiate better prices from you. Those all drive profits down. On the other hand, if buyer power is low because they don't purchase very often or they purchase in small quantities, maybe there are lots of buyers, so if one buyer doesn't want to buy from you, you can easily find another customer. If your brand is valuable and that's important to your buyers, all of these things would suggest that buyer power is low, and those will increase the profitability of your industry. This is a real effect. Over time, industries have very different profitability levels. And so here you can see from the pharmaceutical perspective, that's an incredibly attractive place to be. On the other hand, the drugstores that sell the drugs themselves are not often very profitable. Why? Because it's easy for customers to choose a different drugstore. For you to go from Walgreens to the grocery store or to CVS is a relatively easy switch for you to make. But if a pharmaceutical company has the one and only cancer drug that your doctor has prescribed, you will be buying that. And we can see this in other industries as well. For example, it's generally profitable to be an integrated oil and gas company like Exxon, but it's relatively unprofitable to run, it's much less profitable to run a gas filling station. There's only 3 major integrated oil and gas companies in the world. There are no shortage of gas filling stations, and the cost for you to switch from one station to another is almost negligible. So these aspects of what makes industries profitable is really important to remember. This is a key piece of corporate strategy because you need to be aware of roughly how profitable your industry is in order to determine what your strategic options are and how effective they're likely to be in the long term. In the next video, we're going to talk about the specific competitive strategies that are available to you and a way to think about resources that help you determine whether you can outcompete competitors or not.